Hi, you've made it. I'm so glad you've chosen to join with us in our online home church. If we haven't met before, my name's Robbie and I'm one of the pastors here at Reedy Creek Baptist Church. Last week at our in-person service, we had a bit of a family celebration service where we recognised and thanked our children's ministry leaders and those kids who had graduated from Jam and Epic, and it was nice to suck on an icy pole afterwards as well. But this week, yes, even tonight, is our carols in the backyard. It's been fairly wet outside, so you might be pleased to know that we've moved the event indoors. And due to COVID restrictions, this is a ticketed event only, so I'm really sorry. But if you haven't got a ticket for this carol service, then you're unable to attend. But on the other hand, the Christmas season brings a whole bunch of extra opportunities in which we can gather together and to worship. And this year we've got our Christmas Eve service at 6 p.m. and our Christmas Day service at 8 a.m. Nice and early so you can get on to the activities of the rest of the day. The Remembered at Christmas service will be made available online from Monday the 21st of December. And this is a service that's designed to create space in such a busy time of year for people to reflect and to remember and to give thanks to God for the loved ones that we've had that have passed away. You'll find this service right here on YouTube or on our Facebook page as well from Monday the 21st of December. And finally, our in-person services on Sunday, December the 27th and January the 3rd will be at 9:30 a.m. Yep, that's right. We're only having one single service on the weekends of December the 27th and January the 3rd at 9:30. All of the details to these and all of our Christmas services are on our wedge page, www.rcbc.org.au. Head there to find out all the details. I'm so glad that you've chosen to join with us here at Reedy Creek Baptist Church's online home church. And I pray that you will encounter the power of Jesus during this time.
Sing
We've got Liz Howland joining us at the moment, and Liz is one of the missionaries that Reedy Creek Baptist Church supports. Liz's ministry is in outback Queensland. She takes her caravan out there for several months every year and ministers to the farmers and the community of outback Queensland. And besides going out there and spending quite a lot of time, she also sends out the word of the day and then essentially follows all of that up and does her ministry as the Spirit leads. And Liz, thanks so much for joining us. You've just returned a couple of weeks ago back from your recent trip out to outback Queensland, and wonder if you could just share with us a few of the highlights.
Well, Robbie, this trip I found that the presence of God had gone before me in a greater way than I've ever experienced. You know, I went into uncharted areas such as Yarraka, which is nearly 200 k's west of Blackall, and never been there before, never met anyone from out there. Based myself near the pub, which is the central place in any small country town. And from there was just people just came. They wanted to come and have a chat. They wanted, even travellers, people were set free from deep-seated grief, things they had never articulated. One man for 50 years had not been able to pop the cork of that deep grief, and he was gloriously set free.
Wow.
There were salvations in the caravan. There was so much, just as I envisaged in the van with that club lounge set up, there were people ministered to more deeply than if you were in the clamour of their own home.
For those of you that don't know, God has quite miraculously provided Liz with a beautiful caravan and a car to tow it over the last 18 months, and one of the parts inside the caravan was the club lounge, where Liz really had a sense and a vision of people being ministered to around in this lounge of the caravan. So what are the conditions like out in outback Queensland?
You know, on the news we never hear anything about drought afflicted areas, and you know, it sounded like there was good blanket rain right across the west. But what I found out there was there's some severely drought-afflicted people, and some haven't seen a decent season since 2010, which is 10 years now. One particular young family that I felt to go visit, she was an hour north of a country town called Muttaburra, right in the centre of Queensland. And this young woman was homeschooling 3 children. She managed the property while her husband was away working from home 3 weeks out of 4. And she looked after what was left on the property, homeschooled the kids. The most positive young woman I've met in a very long time. And we were only to have half an hour morning tea, but it turned into a couple of hours because she didn't want me to go. And I also took out a beautiful hamper for them, not knowing that they had a children's birthday party that following weekend. So that really just blessed them and meant so much to them. And one of the things I feel to do, I'm not doing gift cards for the bush this year, but for next year I'm going to do gift cards for back to school needs for people that are homeschooling, just to help them equip their very primitive classrooms. Some of them have such primitive setup. This one was just in a donga. They didn't have the resources, so the $250 gift card we gave her, she and the kids are going to go and shop for the schoolroom. But the phenomenon was, I would just sit at the table in the hotel at Yarraka, and all different kinds of people, travellers and locals, would come and sit for a yarn. And Jesus would come up. They would be the ones that are instigating this direction in the conversation. The hotel is owned by a Christian couple, and so we now have a little lending library on a table over on one side in the lounge area of the hotel, which is pretty amazing, isn't it?
Yeah.
You got a Christian lending library in the hotel.
Yeah. For those who may not have met you before, tell us a little bit about the word for the day that you post out, where they go to, how many you do.
Well, we send out 3,500 word for todays. Now, very much in that process are the wonderful ladies from Reedy Creek Baptist who help with that mail out. It's just extraordinary what they do to help. And they blanket cover towns like Winton, Longreach, Barcaldine, Aramac, Muttaburra, Jericho, Richmond, and another northern one.
Yeah.
I just can't grab right now. And also into a men's camp at Cloncurry, that a mining camp there that the men they're given there. And these, I think you could conservatively say, have the capacity, those 3,500, they would reach 10,000 people.
Wow.
Every 3 months. There's got to be at least 3 in a household.
You were telling me about how at the election you were asking people when they were coming to vote whether they'd received them. And,
Yes.
Yeah.
That was amazing. I was just there with my friends. They were introducing me to people, and so as we chatted, I just said, I'm just interested to know if you receive a little booklet called Word for Today in your mail. And they said, oh yes, we do. And I asked them, did they open it and read it? And they said yes. And some said they enjoyed it. And one woman said that she really, really needs it because it gives her something positive to think about before she goes to sleep. I know that God has put in my spirit that we are changing spiritual atmospheres over regions with that little booklet, Word for Today. So,
what does the next sort of 4 or 5 months hold for you, and what does next year hold?
I feel this urgency to get everything in order, have a really good process there that's streamlined and ready to go both in my office, my ministry, and with the aim of going out earlier next year, about May, weather permitting, and spend a longer time out there because we only had a limited time this year. So that's what I'm feeling. I'm feeling excitement in my spirit, but also a soberness of getting everything in place so that it all flows really smoothly. My board is changing, and just a few major things happening that I have to get sorted really quickly.
Yeah. How can we who are watching be praying for you?
Just for enough personal space and quiet time to seek God, to hear clearly fresh directives from Him, and just that I'll get some good rest time and have plenty of time with my grandchildren. And
What do you remember about Christmas as a child?
the most exciting thing about Christmas as a child was the only day of the year that we had soft drink. And we had unlimited big bottles of lemonade all day. We could start with lemonade if we wanted, but it was only on Christmas Day that we ever saw soft drink.
Wow, that's a beautiful
So that was huge. And I think there was mixed lollies on the table, which we did never have at any time. We lived on an isolated property. So with those big bottles of lemonade, they tasted so good. I truly believe that this is a season of restoration for families. So don't ever give up, because God is able.
perfect.
It just went off.
I think we just got told that was the end.
Yeah? How about that?
Today we're going to have a look at the prophecy made by Isaiah, found in Isaiah chapter 9. Understanding the context, though, will go a long way to helping us understand the bigger picture of what Isaiah is speaking into. So I've got a couple of maps here, specifically for our younger viewers to understand where all of this is happening. So you can see Italy here, but all of the stuff we're talking about today happens over here, modern day Israel. See, the Hebrews escaped from Pharaoh in Egypt and eventually settled in the land that God had promised them. And they settled in their family groups or tribes, 12 of them. Each tribe had its own land. But over time there was a split between the north and the south. The 12 tribes became 2 nations. And for younger Christians, this split can often be quite confusing. The 10 tribes of the north became Israel, and their capital city was Samaria. The 2 tribes of the south became Judah, and their capital city was Jerusalem. And there was a lot of animosity between the 2 nations, often resulting in war. It's important to note, though, that they were 2 nations, but they were still the one people of God. These were the people that God had freed from Egypt and called them to himself. Now, the dominant player in Isaiah's day were the Assyrians. They were feared, they were kingdom builders, they were highly aggressive, and they were in the business of expanding their kingdom. And Isaiah had prophesied that both Israel in the north and Judah in the south would fall to the might of invading armies as punishment for continually turning their back on their God. And sure enough, the Assyrians came down from the north and completely wiped Israel, the northern nation, out. They deported the survivors back to Assyria and assimilated them into their own culture, effectively crossbreeding those 10 northern tribes of Israel out of existence. If you've ever heard of the 10 lost tribes of Israel, this is the people group that they're talking about. They never returned as a nation of people back to Israel. And foolishly, the southern nation of Judah actually celebrated Israel's defeat to the hands of the Assyrians. These were the times that Isaiah lived. He lived in the southern nation of Judah. And by the time he spoke the prophecies that we're looking at today, Israel had gone and Judah had realised the imminent danger that they were in. They were a sitting duck. Judah's military power was even weaker than that of Israel's, and Israel stood no chance. So they feared the superpower of Assyria, and Assyria was literally on their doorsteps, knocking at the great gates of Jerusalem in Isaiah 8. He prophesied that because Judah had rejected God and because Judah had celebrated the defeat of the northern nation of Israel, Isaiah said, "Therefore, the Lord is about to bring against them the mighty floodwater of the river, the king of Assyria with all his pomp. It will overflow all its channels and run over all the banks and sweep into Judah, swirling over it, passing through it and reaching up to the neck. Its outspread wings will cover the breadth of your land, O Emmanuel." The seat of Assyrian power was situated between 2 mighty rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates. And this was a graphic description of Assyria's destructive power, using the irrepressible forces of the natural features of Assyrian's homeland. According to Isaiah, it would seem that the end was very near for Judah. But the last words of this prophecy are very strange, seemingly out of place. Can you remember what Emmanuel means? God with us. It seems an odd place to pronounce God with us at the time of Judah's imminent defeat. Now, this is a seemingly hopeless situation for Judah, this tiny nation completely geographically isolated on this main highway of the irrepressible Assyrian army. But everything changes at this point in the prophecy. It all turns on its head. And Isaiah speaks out prophetic destruction against the nations of the world that would rise up as enemies of Judah. It seems that the memory that Judah is Emmanuel's land changes Isaiah's perspective, and he begins to prophesy against Isaiah's enemies. He says from verse 9, "Raise the war cry, you nations, and be shattered. Listen, all you distant lands. Prepare for battle and be shattered. Prepare for battle and be shattered. Devise your plans, but it will be thwarted. Propose your plan, but it will not stand. For God is with us." Emmanuel. So here's Judah, a sitting duck, ripe for the picking. The whole world knew what Judah had coming for it. It's completely captain obvious. But yet Isaiah sees beyond this imminent disaster and judgment to an ultimate victory and hope for God's people. Despite the destruction that seems so inevitable, the great and powerful enemy of Assyria will be defeated, even shattered. How? Emmanuel, God is with us. It's not because we are with God, but because God is with us. It's a big difference. Let me explain. I used to have a fish, and his name was Decaf because he lived in the hot pot of my coffee percolator. Decaf loved me, and I was his ultimate provider and carer, and you could say that I was kind of like his God. Clearly, I transcended his world, and clearly and evidently, I was far superior to him. Everything he got was through me. Food came through me. Clean water, clean glass, new stones, plastic plants, it all came through me. And so Decaf loved me. When I walked into my bedroom, Decaf used to watch every move that I'd make. He'd follow me from side to side, wanting me to come over. And when I'd come over and say hello, he'd behave like a dog. He'd swim around in circles really, really quickly, waiting for food, because I actually used to hand feeding him. I used to lick the point of my finger and stick it in the fish flake so that one flake would stick. And then I'd hover my finger just over the water, but not going into the water. And Decaf would breach just a little bit and suck the fish flake off my finger. It's quite spectacular and very funny. DC was completely, or Decaf, DC I used to call him, was completely devoted to me. My mum once told me that when she walked into my bedroom, he'd take one look at her, realise it wasn't me, and then just turn around and completely ignore her. But the thing is, regardless of how devoted Decaf was to me, there was absolutely nothing he could do to initiate being with me. He couldn't seek fellowship from me, or he couldn't unite himself to me. He's completely incapable of doing that because he's a fish in a coffee pot and I was a person in the world. So he couldn't come to me when he wanted to, but I went to him when I wanted to. I chose the contact. I initiated the contact. The only way that there was ever contact between me and he was when I enabled it by my choice. Isaiah sees that the ultimate victory and hope is because God is with us. It's completely glorious and wonderful because it's telling us that God, who is distinct from this world, far superior, He's over, in, through, around, He's everything more than this world than we could ever imagine. And so it's impossible for me or for you to initiate or to seek union with Him, just in the same way it was impossible for Decaf to do so with me. But instead, God chooses to be in relationship with us. There's nothing you or I can do to initiate relationship, and yet God chooses to be with us. See, the thing about God is, incredibly, that He chooses to be with Judah and us, even though Judah and us have rebelled against Him. Remember, Isaiah has prophesied the destruction of Israel because of their disobedience to Him. Like, Isaiah had royally ticked God off. They had exhausted His patience. But yet, in the midst of the prophecies of destruction was the promise of hope. A promise that there would be an ultimate victory. Why? How? Emmanuel. God with us. God will not abandon his people. Isaiah continues in chapter 9. Nevertheless, there will be no more gloom for those who are in distress. In the past, he humbled the land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali. See, that's the northern lands of the 10 tribes that had already been decimated by Assyria. He humbled those lands, it says. And then he continues, but in the future, he will honour Galilee of the Gentiles by the way of the sea and along the Jordan. They are the same northern lands. Galilee is the same lands as the lands that were humbled in defeat by Assyria. So the northern lands that were humbled in defeat will one day be honoured. And guess what? Those very lands are the very lands that Jesus grew up in and that Jesus ministered in. So how will these lands be honoured? Verse 2, the people walking in darkness have seen a great light. Those living in the lands of the shadow of death. The shadow of death lands, that's Judah. Remember, the Assyrians are at their door about to knock them over. So those living in the lands of the shadow of death, a light has dawned. You have enlarged the nation and they rejoice before you. For as in the days of Midian's defeat, you have shattered the yoke that burdens them, the bar across their shoulders, the rod of their oppressors. And how's God going to do all of this? Verse 6, for unto us a child is born. To us a son is given. See, God is not merely the realm of ideas, but a person. A son is given, a child is born. It continues, and the government will be on his shoulders. And he will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Not just a person, but God himself. Look, maybe I could describe the Old Testament times as being a little bit like me with my hand in Decaf's fish bowl. When I put my hand in to clean it, I entered his world to care for him. You could say that my hand was on Decaf's life. Certainly his life was in my hands. And I affected the environment of my fish for his benefit. But the reality was, it was only the palm of my hand inside the fish bowl. I mean, there's so much more to me than just simply the palm of my hand or the tip of my finger. There was a lot more to me that Decaf could never ever experience. In fact, the only way that Decaf could have all of me, all of the time, would be if I actually became a fish and lived in the coffee pot with him. Sounds kind of silly, doesn't it? But the reality is, this is exactly what God did. He sent his son as one of us, flesh and blood. God in human form walked this very earth as you and I do, so that we might know him intimately, personally. You know, he entered this world even though we had rebelled against him. He came even still while knowing that he would be rejected and killed. And he came because he chose to be with you. He entered this world so that you could know him. Let's go back to Isaiah's prophecy. Isaiah's prophecy came to pass in 3 contexts. Firstly, Assyria did come and march against Judah, and they literally got to the gates of Jerusalem. They knocked on the door and suggested that they'd better start pleading for mercy. The floodwaters that Isaiah was talking about certainly rose to their necks. But it was a miracle. That night, 180,000 Assyrian soldiers died just outside of Jerusalem. You can read all about it in 2 Kings. God sent an angel. Their plans were certainly shattered, just as Isaiah said they would be, by an act of God. God with us. God was with them and they survived the irrepressible Assyrian army. It was an utter miracle. But the judgment Isaiah prophesied happened too. It was only 90 years later. Israel was eventually punished for their rebellion, just as Isaiah said they would be, when a new power, Babylon, defeated Judah and exiled them. And next, a child was born. God, through Jesus, did enter our existence. The lands of Galilee were honoured, just as Isaiah said they would be, that Jesus would minister there and live there. But there's one more part of this prophecy, the final bit. And this part of the prophecy is still to come. Verse 7. Of the increase of his government and peace there will be no end. He will reign on David's throne and over his kingdom, establishing and upholding it with justice and righteousness from that time on and forever. The zeal of the Lord Almighty will accomplish this. The kingdom of justice and mercy, that isn't yet our existence. We don't yet live in a peaceful world. We live in a world of pain and of war and of oppression and injustice, but it won't always be like this forever. Jesus will return to rule. Only this time, he won't come as the meek, vulnerable baby born into poverty. He won't be led passively to his death like a lamb to the slaughter. Not at all. Jesus will return in triumph as the King. And Isaiah is telling us this story isn't finished yet. There is still more to come. So this Christmas we'll remember the absolute wonder of God coming and living among us to reveal God in a way in which we can understand and relate to. But just as Isaiah's prophecy reveals, the story doesn't end with a baby in a manger, but with the establishment of a new kingdom, the kingdom of God, of which there will be no end. Are you ready for that ending? Are you ready for the next part of Isaiah's prophecy? Because the Christmas story isn't finished yet. There is more. There's another chapter. And God is so passionate about you being part of it that he sent his son Jesus into our world so that you can know him. Choose Jesus now and follow him.